tell me what led to become, you to become Twitter's Pontiff recruitment chief at
Yeah.
Twitter.
So basically back in the days when I knew Julie, we were undergrads and then grad students in anthropology. And then after that period of my life, we were at Stanford together. I became, as my father calls, a wandering delinquent. And I spent about 5 years sort of randomly doing stuff in random corners of the world. I had this amazing but awful online editing job that paid for me to live and made it cheaper for me to live in random places than in San Francisco. And so I basically just kind of did that. It kind of confirmed my love for Latin America. I kept coming back to LATAM. I ended up starting a small nonprofit out in East Africa, and sort of along the way I was able to kind of do the weird stuff I was doing, and particularly when the nonprofit got started, the way I was able to kind of raise funds was because I had this blog that became popular. And back in 2006, if you had a blog, it was probably on blogger.com, right? It had that like blogspot ending. And so when Blogger, they found it when my best friend and I were trekking up to the base camp of Mount Everest for 2 weeks. That's when they found it. And that's when they started driving a ton of traffic to it, right? And so it just like kind of exploded the blog. And it really helped us. We didn't have any actual business aims with it, but it was great to see all these like people logging in. And so about 6 months after that, they tried this little experiment, which was Twitter, which was sort of a 2-week side project they did to kind of see what it would be like. And shortly after that, they asked us to just like come on as early users. And we did. And I quickly built up a following kind of talking about tweeting, stuff for good, social impact, nonprofits out in Kenya. And that eventually led to, I had a sort of a detour in business school for a year and then ended up working at Twitter. I joined when there were about 50 people there. My first few months, I was an MBA intern. So I was just kind of interning. We were looking at sort of how Twitter could be used as a positive force for good in the world. That was my initial mandate because Biz Stone, one of the co-founders of Twitter, was really passionate about that idea. I obviously say that with like, saying that today is very strange because of everything that has happened with social media in the last 12 years. But at the time, it was really cool and new. And, I wrote this book called Twitter for Good, Change the World One Tweet at a Time, which was like the first book looking at Twitter. And it was, talking about how wonderful social media would be for all of us to help make a more equitable world, right? We saw the Arab Spring. We thought, wow, this is great. We saw what social media could do in natural disasters and the Haiti earthquake and the tsunami in Japan. And we just basically had no idea what was going to happen next. We had no idea where we'd be 10 years later and what we'd think of social media. But along that journey, one of my jobs at Twitter was basically to get famous people on the platform. We had a theory of growth then, which was sort of influencer marketing. I don't think we called it influencer marketing yet, but the concept was obviously the same. It was, I just heard you use this phrase the other day, and I always forget it though. It's all boats. No, rising tide rises all boats.
Lifts all boats, yeah.
Okay. So that was the concept. So the idea was you would go into any given demographic. So let's say the country of Colombia or sports as a general thing, and you'd find the most famous or most influential sort of like node super connector in that area, and you get them on the platform. You wouldn't pay them, you would get them on for free. And then they would become a great tweeter, and then everyone else would join. And so we started doing that in a bunch of basically, niches. And one of the niches that we started doing it with was religion. And so that led to basically a year-long project with the Vatican to onboard the Pope. It was wild, but it was a really, really interesting experience. I spent about a year working with them to do it. And I think the thing that was most interesting to me, overwhelmingly, the thing that was most interesting to me was that the team at the time at the Vatican was actually much more agile than the team at Twitter at the time. I think at this point, Twitter already had at least 1,000 employees and was facing a lot of growing pains that happens when a company goes from really small and nimble to sort of big and has no idea what to do. And so it was pretty amazing how I really felt throughout that whole process, the Vatican was able to move significantly quicker than basically Twitter was.
So you said it took a year though.
Yeah, because there were, some fits and some starts, and we had a planned June event in St. Peter's Square that had to be canceled, and there's all kinds of stuff. It was the whole concept initially was kind of crazy, and it had come from this data team at Twitter who had been doing just kind of general research into what tweets were really resonating. And they came across something that they thought was an anomaly at the time, which was basically that Bible verses were getting a lot of engagement, right? So they were getting like a lot of, you get a lot of retweets despite having really few followers, like punching way above their weight, right? And so the more they dug into this, they said, wow, religion is really doing well. We found out it was basically one of the most engaged of all the kind of verticals at that point. So that was where it came from. But I mean, the Vatican was always really interested and forward thinking. And, you know, I think for them, I remember the day because when the Pope tweeted for the first time, he tweeted on an iPad, and you can find the video on YouTube, and it's kind of sad because it's like he's fumbling and doesn't really know where the button is. I'm standing next to him with a ponytail. My mom's always like, why'd you wear a ponytail when you met the Pope? That night we went out, but you know, we went to a nice pizza dinner in Rome with some of the, you know, the key people on the communications team that were doing it. And we were talking about how it had been received. And, you know, very quickly it was clear that it had been received really well. No one that famous had ever joined Twitter or really any social media platform at that point. Since then, well, I don't know. Who else is more famous since then? Maybe there have been other people. I don't know. But that was
Pope is a pretty big one. The Pope is pretty big.
okay. So we had launched in, you know, 8 languages that day. It was a big deal. He'd, you know, immediately gotten, you know, the most number of followers on any social media platform in the shortest time, in that amount of time or whatever. But there were obviously critics. And I remember speaking to one of his, basically his head PR guy at the time, this awesome guy, Greg Burke. And, you know, I was saying, Greg, like, how do you kind of think about the critics, you know, the critics who say that the Pope of all people should not be on, you know, freaking Twitter, right? And he really said that that was something that they had really thought through months and months before, because quite honestly, the Pope going on Twitter in 2012, I think it was, maybe it was 2011, was pretty analogous to the Pope starting Vatican Radio back in the 50s, whenever it did, right? And the same feedback that they had gotten about, you know, the Pope, hearing the voice of the Pope in your ears through your radio, right? It was the same thing. It was just a different version of that. So I think I mean, yeah, I've always just given them so much credit for being able to kind of see that vision from the beginning. And yeah, they took me on a great ride. It was really fun.